мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
We are under attack. It is an attack against Western democracies and on the institutions that bind them.
What Russia's much more interested in doing is depicting the West as a failure.
The regime and President Yanukovych, they were trying to protect their enormous wealth.
This is Kremlin File.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Kremlin File. Today we are joined, Olga and I are joined by Neil Barnett. Hello, Neil.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. And definitely this is going to be a very, very interesting episode. So to begin, we recently have seen alarming reports across, different capitals in Europe, warning of a potential Russian attack on NATO over the next several years. I mean, first, I still can't understand why not give all the weapons needed to Ukraine to, stop Russia in its tracks and have a defeat in Ukraine, and that way Europe wouldn't have to worry. But with that said, and with finally a lot of European countries waking up to the threat that Russia poses and potentially, a war on European soil, in Central Europe, we at the same time saw Trump come out and basically, tell Russia in public signaling for election assistance, like, oh, you can attack any country you want. If anything, I encourage you to attack a NATO country, and U.S. will not fulfill its obligations. And just a reminder that Article 5 has only been used once, and that was for the United States after the September 11th attack by al-Qaeda. So with all that said, how dangerous do you think Trump's comments regarding NATO are? And can you also discuss both Trump's thoughts on NATO over the decades and how this has been a key goal of the Soviet Union and now Russia to collapse NATO?
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously been a long-term strategic objective of the Soviet Union when it existed to break up Western groupings, principally NATO because of its military nature, but also the European Union and other subgroupings, which, for example, explains the Russian interest in Brexit. But to return to NATO, that interest in tearing NATO apart, I think, remained as an objective of the Siloviki and the Russian security establishment, in other words, after the fall of the Soviet Union. And as we can see in Catherine Belton's book, rather like the Taliban after the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, they lay down as the enemy rolled over them, and then they stood back up, but they hadn't changed after laying down. And what we see is under Putin a revanchist Russia, where breaking up NATO, isolating Europe from the United States, is a prime objective. Now, looking at Trump's comments, this has a long history. So in 1987, Trump went to Moscow, still the capital of the Soviet Union, to discuss property development opportunities. And in the end, nothing directly came of those discussions. But he was feted, and his ego was massaged, and who knows what else, but certainly his ego. And he came back to America full of beans. And a short time afterwards, he took out full-page advertisements in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times. I'm sure you're familiar with this. And the theme of these advertisements, it's an open letter from Donald J. Trump on why America should stop paying to defend countries that can afford to defend themselves. Now, the one that I just held up, that original letter from '87, it mainly focuses actually on Japan and Saudi Arabia. It doesn't mention NATO specifically. And at the time, remember, there was this panic in the United States about Japan overwhelming America economically. And so it was a very timely target. The Japanese not only, are mowing our lawn, eating our lunch, but we pay for their defense. Why is that? It was very timely. You also mentioned Saudi Arabia and other allies that don't pay their way. So this message has been constant since 1987. My question is, why does a semi-literate, semi-educated, short-fingered vulgarian, as he's been called, why does somebody of that kind of property developer, someone who doesn't pay his bills, puts entities into bankruptcy to avoid putting his money in his hand in his pocket, why does someone like that spend huge sums on full-page advertisements in the US press proposing a left-field foreign policy idea? Why does he do that? It's just so out of character. It's so random, really. And why does he do it immediately after visiting the Soviet Union? Now, I don't know. He talks about the art of a deal. For everything, him as a transaction. I really don't know. I wasn't there, when they were eating their blinis and whatever in Moscow, and he was being royally entertained by various entertainers, I suppose. We really don't know what transpired, but I find it deeply, deeply suspect. The other thing that I find deeply suspect is, even now, Trump's not in office. He's not even, mayor of a small town, and yet he is going out of his way to ensure that in the Senate, and now it will be in the House, that funding for Ukraine is sabotaged, and to undermine Article 5 and the credibility of NATO. So even if he loses the election, he's performed some kind of service to these goals. And who the ultimate beneficiary of all this is open to conjecture.
And just to add a point on that, in 1987, frankly, when I remember investigating him and that trip, and the thought of, in a communist country putting a gold gaudy tower that's a symbolism of capitalism is a joke. And his trip was under the full control of the KGB. He was, brought in by Intourist at the time, which was a arm of the KGB. So every single movement, every single discussion, every single thing that he saw would have been done, with the control of the KGB. And then, of course, again, he came back, like you said, a few weeks later, decides, to put these ads. And at that time, he was known for two things. One, being a party animal. He was like on all the New York Post, front covers for all his, crazy parties and dating and whatnot. And two, for being extremely cheap. So for him to take money out of his pocket when he was beyond cheap and to pay for this, to put out pretty much the messaging that the KGB would have wanted people to know at the time, because, Russia's and Soviet's goal has always been to break any American alliance. So just to add to that, it definitely, is something that should be looked into more and discussed more, and that this is nothing new. It didn't happen last week. It didn't happen in 2016. It is, an ongoing thing with Trump.
Yeah, what we can say in his favor, at least, is that he's consistent.
Yep.
It's true. It's true. Yeah, he came out with those statements in 87. I remember not only in the newspaper, then he was interviewed, right, on Larry King. I've seen that interview, many times to see exactly what his positions, and they have not changed. Whatever he introduced there has come out, and he's, you're right, he's consistent. That's why today I'm actually shocked that people are saying, oh my God, he's against NATO. He's always been, against NATO, right?
Yeah, and
that's
just to add on to that point with, since we're in 1987, he was a real estate developer, like a party animal in New York City, and the guy wanted a post, to the Soviet Union in order to, basically, solve the nuclear crisis. I mean, come on. Like the host, honestly, we should do an episode on that 1987.
Yeah, that whole
And the years prior to it and the years after, and which direction his life went after, all these favorable things that were done, that would have been in alignment with the KGB. Anyway, go ahead, Mo.
No, actually, I wanted to sort of expand a little bit, about NATO. We know that their recent reports have come out. The Estonian intelligence came out with their annual report. The Norwegians came out with Focus 2024, which I briefly looked over last night. And we also know that there have been statements by British and German leaders, and also their, let's say, higher ups in the military, itself. So this is something to expand a little bit about NATO. And we know that these areas now, they're coming out saying that they're trying to deal with their capabilities in order to counter any sort of Russian, either kinetic or non-kinetic attack. Neil, I don't know, you've probably obviously read through all of this stuff. What's your view on that? Let's say, do you agree with their assessments, their timelines, and know what they see as Russia's goals towards them, or their aims, and Russia's aims in these areas?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's extremely disturbing. Also, today, the Danes made, Danish defense minister made a similar statement about war in, I think, 3 to 5 year timeline. I find this really extraordinary. I've never seen a series of European governments make such definite and alarming statements one after another. And what that suggests to me is that this is not analytical. It's not, what they're saying is not based on looking at Russian positioning and intentions and capabilities and saying, well, based on that X, Y might happen. This seems to me, what's being signaled here is that this is based on intelligence. These statements are far too definite and far too numerous in a short space of time to be just analytical. So there seems to be something that the European allies, and I'm sure the Americans, have learned, which points towards aggression to NATO in the next 5 years. And that's obviously very, very disturbing.
And making what Trump said even more prescient.
And coordinated.
His position, the American position.
And coordinated.
And coordinated.
And, we can see from Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson that Putin seems to, I think, sincerely view his own actions in this sort of epic backdrop of Russian and global history. Now, last week, Andrei Ilyanov, Putin's economic advisor, did an interview with Newsweek where he said that Putin had been planning the full invasion of Ukraine for 19 years. And so one wonders if he sees himself as a successor to Peter the Great and Stalin as this author of Russian greatness. And he's been planning the invasion of Ukraine for 19 years, if that's right. What's the full extent of the plan? Right? And the masterstroke of that plan would be this kind of judo move or judo concept of using your enemy's strength against them, because Putin undoubtedly understands that Russia is dramatically weaker than its combined enemies, but that by using their strength against them, it can still overcome them. And of course, taking any NATO and holding any NATO territory, he would be able to say that he had beaten NATO, full stop, and would see that as his place in history, I suppose. So I think it's an extremely disturbing combination of
No, the news that what you're talking about actually had come out earlier. He had made statements of the sort. He put it at 2003 to 2005, if I'm not mistaken. Those plans that were in place. Right after that, from my reading, and I think this either came out in Euromaidan Press or another publication, even before that, that they had already started recruiting people in Ukraine to go train in Russia itself. That's how, there was that information in there. This is just to add, Neil, to what you've been saying as well. The extent, because we're talking about here is NATO and now Putin's designs, okay, that he's been working on for 19 years. I wanted to move into another area that you've talked about and you've written about, which is more on, let's say, the operations in the infosphere, okay, in the information sphere itself. And you had said that all of the operations that are there are sort of on a tripod basis, right? Can you explain that a little bit? Because I found it really interesting what you had written. And what are those three legs of the tripod?
Right. So what really gave me the idea to express this as a tripod is the slightly unbalanced way that that disinformation and information operations are discussed in Western countries. There's an excessive focus, in my view, on the disinformation itself, which it needs to be studied, at the expense of the two other legs of the tripod. Now, why is that? The first is that disinformation by its nature is put into the public domain. So it's a good thing to study, right? It's not secret, it's not cloaked, it's not hidden. In general, you can look at it, you can analyze it, you can study it, which is great, and that needs to be done. But underpinning those information operations are old-fashioned factors, the two other legs of the tripod. One is financial, so essentially various forms of money laundering, not to conceal criminal origin of money, but to conceal Kremlin origin of money, to fuel those operations, and to fuel the third leg, which is human, the recruitment, witting or unwitting, of people who can run these operations, which again goes back really to old-fashioned espionage. In my work, again, we do investigations into crypto. And what I always say to clients is, there's a technical element to a crypto investigation, but actually it also goes down to people, locations, devices, movements, human stuff, which hasn't changed. And so while we're looking at online disinformation, it's still underpinned by stuff that would have been the same more or less 30, 50, 100 years ago. And so now why is there also reluctance to look at financial and human elements? Politically, in a country like the UK, it's quite comforting to study disinformation itself, because it seems to be like some sort of infectious agent that comes from outside and makes us unwell. But the financial and human legs of the tripod are much more uncomfortable to talk about, because there you're talking about people who are traitors, who work for the other side, some of whom are prominent in public life. You're talking about the use of financial channels, banks, limited liability corporations, real estate, advertising agencies, crypto. There's 101 channels for this kind of funding to come through. So it's less, the financial and human legs are less accessible to studying, but they're also more awkward and uncomfortable to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everybody. If you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to help us out with our independent work, please subscribe to Kremlin File on Substack and on our YouTube channel. Kremlin File is hosted by Olga Lautman and me, Monique Camarra. Our production team is headed by Maddie Kaparov, and the theme music by Oreste Camarra. So please, don't forget to visit our Kremlin File Substack for links to our socials and to wherever you'd like to listen to podcasts.